Remember those cringy movies in Driver's Ed that they would show you? The ones that would have like teenagers or whoever going out to a party and doing teenager things and then leaving and getting in some horrifying car wreck. The movie we're talking about today is like one long extended version of those. This movie still causes me nightmares because it's something that could happen and that does happen. Mari and Phyllis were two teenage girls who were just wanting to go to a concert in the big city. Now it was one of their birthdays, Mary's. Now Phyllis, her friend, would be coming over to pick her up and they would be leaving to go into the city. Phyllis was more of like the city girl, the party girl, the more experienced girl you might say, and Mari had a little bit of a naivety to her, and we see her in the beginning before her friend picks her up and she's at her house and she's getting ready, and it's almost like this coming of age story for her. And at one point she's even talking about how she finally feels like a real woman, and she's getting ready and her parents are doing typical parent things that you see with a teenager. They're warning her about going into the city, being out late, wearing a bra for God's sakes. Before she does leave, her parents will give her like a little present, and they'll give her a necklace and it has a little peace symbol, a little charm hanging from it that will become prevalent later. Now her friend comes and picks her up. We see the girls next going for a hike through the woods, and they end up at a lake or a little river, I'm not sure which it is, but they are down there, they're drinking, and honestly it just reminds me of so much of my childhood and those days where you were completely carefree and you were with your friends and just doing whatever you wanted, and that aspect right there makes this even more horrifying. Now finally the girls decide it's time to go to the concert, so we see them driving into the city, and as they're doing this we begin to hear they're listening to the radio and things like that, and we're hearing this broadcast come over that's talking about an event that has taken place. There has been an escape and there's these fugitives on the loose. Now the radio broadcast will describe these people as savages, okay, and they'll describe all the horrible things they've done. They kill dogs, they hurt nuns, they do horrible things to the most vulnerable of our population. Now they'll also talk about one specifically who's a woman in the group, and her name is Sadie. My aunt used to have one of them little wiener dogs named Sadie. So as we're watching the girls drive into town and listening to this broadcast, the film is showing us two shots, and that is one of the girls driving and then of the fugitives at their house and or the place they're staying, their crash pad, whatever you want to call it. Now they're pretty much gross and they're tawdry. This is one of the things that the film does, is it kind of jumps between these different scenes to show us this collision that will take place later. Now another dynamic that makes this so completely real is the fact that Wes Craven, this is like his, let's call it bombshell entrance into this kind of film world. He was used to basically working post-production on documentaries and things like that by the time he filmed this, did this video. And so he was just used to shooting things like that. So he shot this film in that context. And it does give this movie this very real life documentary type feel. Handheld cameras, the footage is still grainy, on-site location sound recording. All these things add to making it feel very realistic and like you're following each of these people throughout their day and evening. So now once the girls, the concert happens, all this fun stuff, they want to score some weed, they want to get high. So we see the girls walking along, and sure enough they run into one of the fugitive people. Now he's standing outside. This particular person in this group, he is coming down from heroin, he needs a fix. And so he is in that zone. So he's after his own little thing as well. So the girls ask him if he can score anything, and he's like no, and they walk off. But then he's like, wait, what am I thinking? My buddies were just sitting here talking about they want to party or whatever. So he tells them, yeah, you know what, I can get you something, come on back to the house to my friends. The girls do this and you're just like, oh my God, don't go. Once the girls go into the little crash pad, you can just tell that it's like mice who have walked into the cat's trap. And the fugitives start to interact with them, and these girls can tell something's not right here, and they lock the door and the girls are locked in, and this is when things go very downhill for these two young ladies. Once this realization happens and we can start to see that they are now trapped in this sinister location, we begin to then see snapshots of back home at Mary's house with her mother and father. Now, the mother and father, they come across as just very wholesome, very, Beaver Cleaver kind of a vibe. And they're, preparing this little happy birthday party with a little banner, happy birthday, Mary, the whole 9 yards. And you're just like, oh my God, if they only knew what was going on. But now back at the Fugitives crash pad, they're starting to rough these girls up. And remember, Phyllis, the more, worldly girl or whatever, she's going to talk back. She's not going to cower down too much. And so they begin to really rough her up while all the time Mary's over there watching in utter horror as to what's going on. And now, in addition to beating her up and stuff, they do this off camera, but it does look like they assault her in a particular way for the first time that evening, but it's shown off camera. And again, her friend's sitting there watching with this look of like, oh my God, on her face. Now, also what's interesting is the actress, Sandra Caswell, that's the name she wanted her for this movie, she would say, or, and her co-stars and stuff would say that they never came out of character, the Fugitives and whatnot, and they were like, we were utterly horrific to this girl, and even Wes Craven would talk about that. And so she basically stayed completely freaked out all the time, and literally that stuck with her with this film. Now later in the future, when the actors and stuff would be interviewed about the movie and whatnot, she was always just kind of never there, keeping her distance from the whole situation. So anyways, back to the story. After all this takes place, the next morning we see them carrying one of the girls down the fire escape, and they're taking her and putting her in the trunk of the car where the other friend is already waiting. Now meanwhile, back at Mary's house at this point, the parents are on the phone with the cops, and they're like, look, she's been gone, what's going on? They're worried their daughter hasn't shown back home. And this is another storyline that's going on here, is the ineptness of the police in this movie. And the police are basically like, she's a teenager, don't worry, this is normal, the whole 9 yards. And again, we see this happen all the time. This is a real thing that takes place. The Fugitives will continue to drive with these girls in the trunk, and they're doing weird little fugitive things along the way, like dry humping one another in the convertible. So eventually the Fugitives' car will break down. Something happens with it, it breaks down, they get out, and then they realize we're done. So they get the girls out of the trunk, and when they get them out of the trunk, this is when Mary looks and she sees her mailbox and realizes that the Fugitives have broke down like at the end of her driveway. The Fugitives will direct the girls into the woods and start taking them to where we saw them earlier, this body of water. Now again, the movie will flash to the parents' house, but now the police are actually at the home. And they're in there and they're eating the birthday cake, and they're reassuring the parents that, do not worry, this is fine, we're gonna, they're gonna pop up, this is normal teenage stuff. Well, anything far from normal is going on. So the Fugitives get the girls in the woods, and they start to do this like completely sadistic, twisted game with them, and they're essentially telling them what to do. And so one of them is like, he's like, piss your pants, and the girl's like, what? This is Phyllis, the older one, and Phyllis is like, what? And he's like, I said piss your pants. And she's like, and he's like, if you don't piss your pants, I'm gonna hurt Mary. They do something to Mary, they like cut her or something like that. And so Phyllis is like, damn. So Phyllis is like, okay, hold on. And so she starts to pee in her pants, and then they all start laughing at her, and Sadie's like, oh my God, look at it, she's pissing in her pants. You're just like, oh my God. So the one fugitive who's looking for his fix, he's kind of agitated, and he's seen this go on, and he's a little, inept himself. And he's like, look, you're gonna hurt someone. And so now the fugitives are telling Mary to get up, and they're like, punch each other in the stomach and do this stuff, punch her as hard as you can. And that's when this dude's like, y'all are gonna hurt them, someone's gonna die, make them like make out with each other or something. Y'all, this is when I'm just like, oh my God. So they make them get naked, okay? Then they like make them do, certain acts to one another. And Phyllis is like, it's just me and you here. It's just me and you here trying to block everything out. And, I think that she ends up performing some kind of act on Mary. Now, remember, the whole time earlier in this evening when Mary's getting ready and she feels like, she's entering into womanhood for the first time and all this, and you're like, oh my God. Wes Craven did such a good job at setting this up so that the enormity of it hit you even harder. So this is a completely horrifying situation that these young ladies are going through. Now, once this is all done with, and Mary, her soul is broken, you can just tell. And her friend Phyllis tries to take this little narrative to sneak out. And she's like, look, I'm really cold. Can I put my clothes back on? Yada, yada, yada. And so they're like, yeah, you can do that. Well, then she puts her clothes on and she kind of tells Mary, she's like, I'm going to make a run for it. And when I do, you scream for help or you go or whatever when they're chasing me. And Mary's like, okay, girl. So she does just this, and just like she planned, the fugitives start to chase her. Well, they leave the one dude coming down off heroin to guard Mary. Now, they haven't even started chasing little Phyllis, and Mary's already trying to work this guy over, and she's like, look, just let me go, and really trying to convince him. And finally she's like, look, my dad is a doctor, he works with addicts, I can help you, I can get you your fix, I can get you methadone or whatever. And so this kind of makes him say, okay. So while Mary's doing that, you're seeing the scenes of the other fugitives chasing Phyllis all over the woods. I do think that there was a little bit of crossover, because one thing that I was like, okay, this looks like pretty vast woods. Why does she keep kind of running past the same thing? But, that's just me being petty. So now all the while that this is going on, we pan back over to the police, to the two sheriff guys, and they're back at the station and they're talking, and then this, be on the lookout or whatever comes over their little police thing, and it's talking about the fugitives and where they were last seen, and it's in their area, and they're talking about the car, and the cops are like, wait a minute, that was the car that was broke down at the end of the driveway we just left. And so they're like, oh my God, come on boys, let's head back over. Now, back in the woods with this cat and mouse game going on, Phyllis is growing tired from running, and she finally makes her way to this little graveyard in the middle of the woods. And through the other trees, she can see the road, and you're like, oh my God, she's almost there. And that is one thing that this film does, is the, oh my God, they almost got away. Oh my God, they're almost at their home. Oh my God, that vibe. She goes into this graveyard, but then all of a sudden the fugitives come out, and they've been hiding, and you're like, oh no. Oh no. And even Phyllis has that look of, she knows, it's done, I'm trapped, I can't get away from them at this point. Now what will happen is the fugitives will all hone in on her, they will attack her, they will assault her in various ways, and they will literally just gut this poor girl. And when I say gut, I mean literally. I'm talking Sadie is pulling her intestines out. Now meanwhile, back with the damn cops, their car runs out of gas on the way, so they have to get out and start walking it. So you already know that these dudes are completely useless to help with anything at this point. So after this, the fugitives make their way back, and they run into Mary and the other fugitive who is coming down. And, they catch them in the act, and they're just like, what are you doing, whatever. So they take poor Mary, they strip her, they assault her in the most horrifying way. And at this point, Mary is broken. Her spirit is done. You can just, she's done. And so she gets up and she goes and throws up in the woods. And the fugitives are kind of standing there, and she just slowly walks with this blank look on her face towards the water. Almost like she's like, I'm just gonna ignore everything else and walk back home. Like she's resigned herself to her fate. And sure enough, one of the fugitives takes a gun and he shoots her several times, and then she just kind of disappears into the water. And you're like, oh my God, could this movie get any worse? Well, guess what? It does. So the fugitives will wash themselves up, and they will make their way out of the woods. And lo and behold, they make their way to, guess whose house? Mary's parents. Now, of course, at this point, the fugitives don't know that these are their victims' parents, and the parents obviously don't know that what's happened to their daughter in the woods at this point. So, the fugitives are basically saying, look, we're on a business trip and we broke down and yada yada yada. And the parents are just like, oh, well, you know what? Why don't you stay the evening? Why don't you just come in the house? Now, I know this is a different time. This is in the 70s. And so I'm trying to even wrap my mind around, if strangers showed up at your home, would you just let them stay the night? And maybe you would back then. I don't know. But regardless, I was like, oh, Lord, this is about to get saucy. So the parents take the fugitives in. They put them in the guest rooms. Well, one of those rooms is Mary's. And so the fugitives are all hanging out. And this is when they realize, look at whose room we are. They're looking at pictures, oh my God, look at this, guess whose house we're staying in. And that's where you're like, whoa. And this whole aspect of how pure and nice and welcoming the parents are, and they have no idea what these horrible monsters have done to their daughter and her friend. It's just, So later the parents will have dinner, and they'll have them, the fugitives will eat with them, obviously. And this is where the parents start to notice something that's a little off. They notice, the tattered clothing, the kind of weird hair. Sadie drinking red wine, gulping it, I should say, like she's a high school girl on her way to the prom with a fresh bottle of Mad Dog 2020. So remember the one fugitive who Mary had almost gotten him to help her escape? Well, he's like coming down hard, okay? And he's entering this zone of like getting sick and doing all that. So at one point he's in the bathroom, he's barfing, all this stuff, and the mother's like, oh my God, what's going on? Let me go check on him. And so she goes into the bathroom, and this is when she can start to tell, something's not right with these people. Well, when she's in there helping him, she sees the necklace that her daughter had been given to them by them. So she's like, wait a minute, that's the necklace that we gave our daughter, and now they're wearing it. So now there is the chance that they could have just had the same necklace, so that, the mother's antennas are up, but, she gets rid of him, she sends him back in his room, and then she goes in their other room. They had 2 rooms, and she like snoops in their suitcase. Well, she finds all their other bloody clothing, and obviously she's like, oh my God, oh my God. So at this point she gets her husband, and they end up going down to the woods, the body of water, where we'll see a scene where they've retrieved Mary from the water. Now, I do feel like there's a little bit of some kind of continuity issue going on here, but that's me being petty. It is what it is. It was fine. The end result is they figure out that obviously their daughter is deceased, and these people have literally just done some unthinkable things to their daughter. Now, the next thing goes down for me in one of those scenes that still to this day sends chills down my spine, to my very bone. So the next scene we see are the parents, and they're dressed up in like scrubs, like they're going to perform surgery, and they're waking the fugitives up, and one specifically, and he wakes up or whatever, and this is kind of at first like, well, what? Why aren't the other ones waking up? Well, they sit there and take a hammer, and they make him open his mouth, and they take a chisel and put it on his front teeth, and then when they bring the hammer down, he wakes up, and it's him having this dream, and you're like, oh my God. Just the idea of somebody doing that to your teeth, literally, I can't take it. So now he gets up, and he goes out. He realizes the parents are awake, and so he finds the mother. Now, mind you, the parents have been like doing their own little plan all along. You know what I mean? They're like, okay, look, this is how we're going to do this. So he gets up, and he finds the mother, and she's going to take this angle of, I'm going to seduce this guy. I'm going to go that direction. And so she's talking, and she's like, oh no, my husband's here. He had to do this, but I want to have a real man. Now, the fugitive that she is seducing, his name is Fred Lincoln, and actually his previous work would come in handy for this specific role because he worked in the adult industry before and after in the movie business, adult films, and he worked in that, like I said, before and after this movie. Now, what's interesting is later in interviews, he would say the one thing that he regretted doing in one movie was Last House on the Left, and he would go so far as to say he wished that it had been banned in the USA. He felt like it was too over the top. So use that as your barometer, okay, for how exploitive and bad this film is. For him to be like, no, that right there, that's in poor taste. So the mother's leading him around. She's, talking to him about how she wants a man and all this stuff, while the father is booby-trapping the house. Now, this fugitive, Fred the fugitive, we'll call him, he's like, he wants to give it to her and da-da-da-da-da. And he's like, I could do it with my hands tied and all this. Well, she uses this as leverage or whatever and kind of tinkers with him and toys with him. So they end up outside, and he keeps going with this, and he's like, go ahead, take my necktie, tie my hands up. And she's like, I couldn't, that makes me feel naughty and dirty, but if you insist, I will. So she gets him all tied up, and then she's like, I'm gonna show you a saucy time. So she begins to perform certain acts on him, we'll say, and he's getting all excited, hands tied behind his back, and then right when he's, ready to end the session, she bites it off, and you're like, you can imagine his screaming and wailing wakes everyone in the house up, the other fugitives, and so now it's on. They're like, oh my God. So remember, at this point, there's 3 fugitives. There's Sadie and then the 2 guys. And one of them is coming down off heroin, so he's not, really doing too well. And the other one's like the leader of the group, basically. The leader of the group fugitive and the father start to fight it out and duke it out in the living room. And Sadie's kind of like disappeared for this. Now, what will happen is the lead fugitive, he'll run into a couple of these little booby traps, whatever. So that all happens. They're fighting, they're struggling. The father will get a gun. When all of a sudden, the junkie fugitive will appear with this gun, and it's like he's going to shoot his, cohort, his other fugitive. And this fugitive guy's like, what are you doing? I should have killed you back then, and da-da-da. And then he's like, take the gun and point it at your head and blow your head off. And he keeps screaming that over and over, and you don't see it on camera, but the guy eventually does what he is being told to do. And they just show him sliding down the wall after he takes his own life, and you're like, oh my God, what power does this guy have? So now after all this struggle, all this fighting, we hear a chainsaw fire up. And this is me, I'm like, no. I'm like, after this absolutely insane movie, we're gonna even go down this road. Literally, for this film, if you watch my review in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I was like, they drew a line in the sand, they crossed it. Okay, there was no line in the sand. This film was like, if there is anything that we can violate or exploit, we're gonna do it. And using a chainsaw to kill people in the very end of this movie is just par for the course. So the father has this chainsaw, and he's like going in the living room around the main fugitive guy. Well, now Sadie has come out at this point, and she like goes outside where she encounters the mother, and they're fist fighting and all this stuff, and Sadie ends up, going somehow into the pool or something like that. It's kind of weird how she ends up in there, but she does. She's trying to get away. She falls in the pool, and everything's coming to a head. Well, the father has got the fugitive guy on the floor. There's nowhere else to go. And then right when he's lifting the chainsaw, the damn front door opens, and the cops come in finally, and they're like, don't do it. And the dad's just like, I'm kind of crazy now. And so he sits here, and he's like, wow, wow, wow. And he saws the guy up in front of the cops. Well, outside of the pool, the mother has taken Sadie, and she's slashing her neck in the pool at this time. And so then it's like everyone kind of converges back, and you're just like, oh my God, what did I just watch? And so basically you're left with this whole thing of, how is the carnage of this aftermath going to affect them for the rest of their life? Mind you, I might have forgotten to say, when the parents went down and found their daughter, they brought her corpse up to the house. So she was laying on the sofa the whole damn time all this is going on. And you're just like, look, okay, this is going to be a damn birthday party that goes down in books. Now, y'all, as you can imagine, this film was so turned up, so bad, it was banned in a couple of countries. Now, United Kingdom basically wouldn't give it a rating, and so, which meant that nobody would play it for the longest time. And then in Australia, it actually was banned. I mean, it wasn't until like into the 2000s that these things were put out there. Some of them on like, straight to VHS type situation, basically. I mean, this movie crossed boundaries. Now, here's the thing. Wes Craven, and many of you are going to be like, Wes Craven, Nightmare on Elm Street. Wes Craven has delivered to us, has reinvented the horror genre so many times. Last House on the Left, Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream. These are all pivotal movies that shaped periods of the horror industry, if you will. And so many of them really relate back to some of these origins of Last House on the Left. To this day, it resonates with people. It's one of those films that they're like, I like horror films, but that's one of those that I don't want people to know that I'm actually watching that. I'm slightly embarrassed. And when I rewatched it to make this film, I was like, please don't let Matt come out here and see what I'm watching. Like, I'm like, I don't want people to think that I'm this, because if you're a horror fan and you're probably watching this, you know how some people are freaked out that you like horror and they think all movies are like this, where they're like, what do you like, watching snuff films? And it's like, no, I just like to be scared. But this film crosses that line. If you haven't watched this, there is a remake of it, but I implore you to watch the original first because of the rawness of it. You can't recreate that. And and then watch the remake. Now, I appreciate you watching this. If you're still here, if you still want to see some more stuff by me, click the rest of the playlist for the other movie reviews I do. And if you like true crime, check out my other channel, Reporting Live from the Sofa, and check out what I have to say about people doing truly horrible things like this, except it's for real. Anyways, I appreciate you watching. Until next time, I'll see you then.